Can I? While I'm teaching? And then the Lord said, I love you. That was fun. All right, let me see if I can get this remote to work here. It works. Okay, so this week we are continuing our series called, can I say it? Mine? We started the series last week, and it's all about making your faith your own. Unfortunately, there are many who spend their entire young lives growing up in the church, and the entire time really only functioning off of the faith of their parents, or their older sibling, or their grandparents, or whatever, and then they leave the church when they graduate high school, and for many, never ever come back at all. We talked a little bit last week about some of the statistics of church growth, church degeneration in between generations, where in every generation it seems less and less that people are actually following after the Lord. And it's because it's not being passed down. And so each generation is less and less making faith their own. You could say that the apple is not falling near the tree. I'm sure you've all heard the phrase, the apple falls near or far to the tree, meaning that those who come in the next generation look a whole lot like the ones in the previous generation. For example, I could say, my dad was a professional bowler. And that was true. Believe it or not, Rick Valilla was on the PBA tour. It's crazy. Yeah, for real. He was a professional bowler. He was also a professional putt-putt player. No, I'm not making this up. He actually won state tournaments in putt-putt. He did many things professionally. Bowling was one of them. Okay? I am lousy at bowling. I'm terrible. I can't do it. The apple fell far from the tree. And then it rolled a great distance. Yes. I have more balls in the gutter than I do on the pins. And my dad, it was beautiful. He would just come up and he would go like that, and the ball would spin, and it would knock all the pins down. If I try to do that, I throw it in the next lane. So the apple fell far from the tree. When we're talking about faith and making it our own, hopefully if your parents or your grandparents or your older sibling or somebody that has brought you to church, hopefully the apple, being you, will fall near the tree and you'll make it your own. So I figured, why not provide some visuals of what it looks like when the apple doesn't fall far from the tree? One generation really does follow the next. Let's see if we can cut these front lights off so we can see the thing better here. Yeah, these up here. There we go. So, here's a picture where the apple does not fall far from the tree. You can see the baby drinking. Here's another situation where the apple does not fall far from the tree. I don't know who wrapped up who first. I would totally do something like this with my kid.
I was going to say, I don't know why that's so scary, because that's just replace it with Notre Dame.
Oh, you know it. Absolutely. My son actually does this, and it's super cute. Super cute. Now that I'm using the riding mower, he calls it Daddy's tractor, and he wants to ride Daddy's tractor. So cute. Here's a situation where the apple has not fallen far from the tree at all. The child has learned. Uh-oh. I think we're stuck. This may have been what happened last time. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay. Well, yeah. All right. There's a situation where the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. You can imagine the little biker. Here we go. If you can see, there's a big stormtrooper and a little stormtrooper. And I'm assuming that they're probably heading to this kind of party, where there's a big Iron Man and also a little Iron Man. Yes. Two dogs. We got to adjust the brightness on this. We'll do it next time. Two dogs looking the exact same way. Father and son, I'm guessing. The little garbage man. Right? He's going to pick up the trash in that, I guess. The apple has not fallen far from the tree. And finally, that is awesome. He has learned how to relax from Dad. Sometimes the apple does not fall far from the tree. You guys know that my own son is a perfect example of this. He loves Notre Dame. I'm not forcing it on him either. Okay? I am not forcing him to say anything here or there. When I ask him, and I swear to you, I did not teach him this. When I ask him, Eli, what do you want to watch on TV? He says, I want to watch Notre Dame football, Daddy. I'm like, yes! I don't care that it's past your bedtime. Request granted. You have won my heart. Sometimes. Huh? Yes, Kevin. I hate you all. But there are times when the apple does fall far from the tree. And that's what we're going to be looking at this evening. Sometimes the apple falls pretty close. Other times, it does not. So, if you've brought your Bibles, turn to 1 Samuel. If you did not bring your Bible, I echo the same refrain. How dare you? How dare you? 1 Samuel. In this story, we're going to look at several characters that are important. And we're going to continue this story next week. The first character that we're going to look at in this story is a guy named Eli. Oh. Not the one that we named Eli after, but Eli nonetheless. He is the high priest. He's the judge over Israel. The second characters that we're going to look at are Hophni and Phineas. Eli's two wicked sons. And those really are their names. Hophni and Phineas. Wicked like evil. Yeah, we're going to get to that. We're going to look at Hophni and Phineas. I feel like you have to say that in a British accent, even though it's Hebrew. Hophni and Phineas. And finally, we're going to look at Samuel, Eli's godly adopted son. So first, let's look at Eli. Eli is the, as I said, high priest and judge over Israel. Now, briefly, let me explain what that means. In the Old Testament, all of the worship was done at the temple. And so the presence of the Lord literally dwelled in the temple. And there was only one person who was allowed to ever walk into the presence of God, which was in the innermost place in the temple. The temple had levels, right? So there's the outer court, then the inner court, then the court for the priest, and then there's the Holy of Holies, which is where the Most High dwells. And the only person that could ever go into the Holy of Holies was the high priest. And he could only do that once a year on the Day of Atonement. So this was a very, very important guy. He essentially was the spiritual leader over the entire nation. So he led the entire nation in worship, in sacrifice. He's the one who oversaw all of the sacrifice for sin. He's the one who led all of the services. He's the high priest. In addition to that, during the time that that Eli was the high priest, he was also the judge, because this was before Israel ever had a king. So before there was a line of kings leading the nation politically, the nation would be led by judges. And it just so happened that in this particular case, Samuel was also the judge over Israel. I keep saying Samuel. Eli. Eli was also the judge over Israel. So not only is he the spiritual leader over Israel, he's also the political leader over Israel. So, if it helps to picture it sort of like this, he's the president and the pope at the same time. Crazy. Big, big job that this guy has. And he had a 40-year reign as high priest and judge over Israel. So for a period of 40 years, he was the most important man in the entire nation. Politically, spiritually, he was the model that everybody else was following. He was making all of the decisions. He was the one who was leading the entire people of God. We also find out from 1 Samuel chapter 1 that he ends up adopting this kid named Samuel. And Samuel would later become the high priest after Eli. So Eli is a guy that in many ways is a model to follow. You know, last week we looked at the statistics of generation to generation. He would have been the guy in the upper generation who said, "Follow me." Unfortunately, when we look at the next generation, and we find Hophni and Phineas, they did not make their father's faith their own. Their father was the spiritual leader over Israel. He was the one who was the most important spiritual figure in the entire country. Hophni and Phineas did not say to their faith, "Mine? I can't stop." And we're going to look at several aspects of the story. So let's start with chapter 1. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at a bunch of pieces, and then we're going to come back and break it down. So in chapter 1, we find that there's a guy who's coming to the temple to offer sacrifices with his wife, whose name is Hannah. In verse 3, it says, "Year after year this man went from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phineas, the two sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord." So we find out in this verse that Hophni and Phineas were serving with their father in the temple. He was the high priest, and they were priests serving under him. The rest of chapter 1 talks about the story of Samuel, which we're going to look at in a bit more detail next week. But essentially, the short version of the story is this. A woman named Hannah has no children. And it's breaking her heart that she has no children. And year after year, she goes to the temple begging God, "Please allow me to have a son." And then she makes a vow to the Lord. She says, "Lord, if you will give me the privilege of having a son, I will give him to you to serve you in the temple for the rest of his life." She makes this vow before Eli, the high priest, and the Lord grants her request. And so she has a son named Samuel, and she keeps her vow, and she brings Samuel to the temple, and Eli basically adopts him as his own son, raises him in the temple. Chapter 2 is Hannah's prayer, where she's rejoicing that the Lord has granted her request. And in verse 11 it says, "Then Elkanah," which is her husband, "went home to Ramah, but the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli the priest." So Samuel becomes a servant as well. Now here's where we pick up with Hophni and Phineas. In chapter 2, verse 12, it says, Eli's sons were wicked men. They had no regard for the Lord. Now it was the practice of the priest with the people that whenever anyone offered a sacrifice, while the meat was being boiled, the servant of the priest would come in with a 3-pronged fork in his hand. He would plunge it into the pan or kettle, or cauldron or pot, and the priest would take for himself whatever the fork brought up. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. But even before the fat was burned, the servant of the high priest would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, Give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, only raw. If the man said to him, Let the fat be burned up first, then take whatever you want, the servant would then answer, No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force. This sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. That seems a bit confusing, so let me explain. The high priest and the priest serving in the temple were given a portion of whatever was sacrificed on the altar. So, if someone came and offered a lamb in atonement for their sin, that lamb would not go to waste. It would be cooked on the altar, and the priest would receive a portion of that meat to eat for themselves. But there were certain regulations on what they were allowed to take. First, the meat would be boiled, and then it would be put on the altar and sacrificed to the Lord. And so the Lord said, when the meat is being boiled, you can take a fork and take some out of the pot, and that's for you. But don't take it from my portion, which is on the altar. And what was going on here was that Hophni and Phineas were taking not from their portion, but from the Lord's portion. So they showed complete contempt for the sacrifice of the Lord. Imagine if you had to make a sacrifice for your sin. You bring a lamb and you present it to the priest, believing this is going to be put on the altar before the Lord to atone for my sins. And then the priest, instead of doing what God asked them to do, acted selfishly with your sacrifice. Would that make you mad? Yes. It would make me very mad.
Like if you bring your tithe, and then like the priest takes
Yeah.
tithe from himself.
Exactly. If you brought a tithe, say you brought $50 and you put it in the plate, and as it's going to the front, one of the deacons pulls the plate in, pulls $20 and puts it in his pocket. We'd be like, "Well, what are you doing?" That's a good example. That's sort of what Hophni and Phineas were doing there. And it gets worse. We pick up in verse 22, where it says, Now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So he said to them, Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, it is not a good report that I hear spreading among the Lord's people. If a man sins against another man, God may mediate for him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him? His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. So not only were they stealing from the offerings, they were also sleeping with women at the temple. Now that one's obvious. Okay, that's a huge no-no. In other religions back then, that was one of the customs, that sex was a part of the pagan temple worship. And so they were taking pagan practices and bringing them into the temple. So these, like I said, were very, very wicked men who did not make their father's faith their own. Remember that Eli is the spiritual leader of Israel, serving on behalf of all the people, and here are his sons stealing and sleeping around in the temple. Wicked, wicked men. There's a few things that I want us to learn from these guys and examine about ourselves to really find out, are you making your faith your own, or are you just going through the motions? The first thing we find is that they were indeed just going through the motions. In chapter 1, verse 3, it tells us this: year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phineas, the two sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. If we only read that verse, we would assume that Hophni and Phineas were really good guys. If all we read was this verse, we would believe that they too were spiritual leaders. We would believe that they were serving in the same way that their father was, that they were standing in the gap spiritually for the people of Israel. If we stopped there, that's what we would find. But when we keep on going and read about the things that they were doing, what it reveals to us is that, yeah, they were serving in the temple, but really they were just going through the motions. They did some priestly things. They wore priestly garments. They performed some priestly actions. But that's really all they were doing. It was nothing more than just some activity. Just going through the motions. And so the first question that you have to ask yourself is this: is my faith genuine, or am I just going through the motions? Am I believing this and acting this out with my entire life? Is it consuming me? Or is this a situation where I'm just doing this out of habit? You know, I've brought up worship many times with us. Sunday mornings, Wednesday nights, whatever it might be. Because I think a lot of times we're guilty of just going through the motions when we are in worship. The music is playing, we recite words that we've memorized, and we move on. And nothing really is going on in our hearts. Is that true as well of the rest of your faith? Is it genuine? Or are you like these guys going through the motions? The next thing we see about these guys is that faith was an activity for them, not a worldview. It did not affect how they lived. This goes right along with the first point, that because they were going through the motions, Christianity was just a job. For them, it was just an occupation. It did not affect their heart at all. It did not affect the way that they thought, the way that they see the world. It didn't affect the lenses through which they make decisions. It was just something that they did. And we have to ask ourselves, is that true of us as well? Is our faith more than going through the motions? Is it just activity? Or does it really affect the way that we live? You know, the series right before this one was called Disconnect. And that's what it was all about. Is there a disconnect between who we are here and who we are outside the church? Are we living out our faith at home? Are we living out our faith at school? Are we living out our faith in our circle of friends? Or are we just play acting while we're here? For these guys, that's what they were doing, was they were play acting. This was not their worldview. This was not what was deep-seated in their hearts. It was simply an activity. It was a job, not something that was genuine. The next thing that we see, going again back to verse 3, because they were the sons of Eli, they were priests. They were really only there because of their father. If their father was not the high priest, they would not have been priests either. This is one where we really have to ask ourselves a hard question. If your parents did not bring you here, would you be here? If your parents had nothing to do with church, would you? Do you come because your grandma brings you, or your mom and dad bring you, or an older sibling brings you? Or do you come because you want to be here to worship God, to experience His presence? That's one that we really have to take time to examine in ourselves, guys. Am I here because my parents brought me here? Or am I here because this is where I know I want and need to be? Because if the only reason that you're here is because your parents bring you, or your grandparents, or your aunt and uncle, whoever it might be, if that's the only reason why you're here, that is a very good sign that your faith is probably not your own. That you haven't owned your faith. Because if somebody else has to do it for you, then it's not really yours at all. Because on the days that your parents can't bring you, you just kind of shrug and say, all right, whatever. And then when you graduate and you move and nobody's bringing you, you won't come either. These guys only ministered before the Lord, quote unquote, because of their dad. Their dad was the reason. Is your faith your dad's, your mom's, or is it yours? Next week, we are going to look at Samuel. Samuel was adopted by Eli, so raised in the same house, has the same father, but he has a much different result. He owns his faith. He becomes the next high priest, and we are going to look at exactly how that happened. But I really want us to take the time to look over these things and examine these things about ourselves. Am I just going through the motions? Is my faith nothing more than activity? Or does it really affect the way that I live? Everywhere. Every day. And am I here only because of my father? Or my mother? Or my whoever? This PowerPoint is going to be posted on my blog. And I want you guys to, throughout the week, if you need to look at it, because I want you to not just listen to a lesson on a Wednesday night and then forget about it by Thursday morning. My hope is that the things that you learn affect the rest of your week. My hope is that your parents are emphasizing these things throughout the week themselves. So, join me in prayer as I close, and then, like I said, next week we're going to look at the opposite example. Samuel, who made his faith his own. Father God, thank you so much for your truth and your word.